Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to today's WIRES webinar, which is focused on last week's election and the impacts on transmission energy policy. And we're really pleased to have with us today Kellie Donnelly, who is going to walk us through all of this. Kellie is currently the Executive Vice President and General Counsel with LotSixteen, which is a bipartisan government affairs and communications firm. Kellie has over 20 years of experience with the federal government in both the legislative and the executive branch, but most recently, she was the Chief Counsel for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. She brings a real insider's perspective to some of these issues and how things work up on Capitol Hill in particularly. So I'm certainly interested in hearing her perspective on what we have to look forward to with the coming transition. It was a Freudian slip on my part. Transition and what we might be seeing in 2021. So very interested to hear her perspective. For people who are viewing, Kellie is willing to take questions, which will be submitted through the questions function on the right side of your screen. You can type those in and submit them, and I will pose those questions to Kellie either as we go through the presentation or at the end of the presentation. And I would encourage everybody to think of questions that you'd like to have Kellie address. She's more than willing to take a stab at trying to answer what we're interested in hearing about. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Kellie, and thanks again for being with us here today.
Well, thank you, Larry, for that kind introduction. I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate being invited here to be with you all virtually today and talk about the election 2020 impacts on transmission policy. Let's take a quick look at our agenda and an overview of what we're going to be looking at today. So federal election results. I'm glad we didn't do this the week of the election because we're still kind of waiting to see the very final results. We'll also talk about changes in committee leadership at the congressional committees due to retirements and also Republican term limits. Talk about what is happening at FERC. The recognition from some policymakers now that renewables aren't wireless. And then the last two, transmission policy at issues in the transition period and for the upcoming 117th Congress. Okay. So for our next slide, we had been looking at 4 electoral scenarios. So now we're making some progress. I mean, there used to be a time when you would know who won by the end of election night, but that's not where we are. We have whittled it down to 2, however. So it looks like we're going to be in scenario 3, where Congress maintains the status quo, but the White House flips and Biden takes the presidency. But there is still a chance for door number 4 for a blue wave sweep, depending on what happens in Georgia. So we can take a look at some of the key presidential swing states. We're just going to go through some of the election results. And of course, everybody knows at this point that the magic number for electoral votes, 270. Biden certainly seems like he has that. President Trump has yet to concede. And you can see some of the states that were flipped from Trump's 2016 win, which included Arizona and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And Trump managed to hold on to Florida. It looks like he'll get North Carolina. But again, it does not seem like there's a path forward for President Trump, despite the litigation that is now ongoing. On the Senate races, all eyes are on Georgia for the January 5th runoff for the 2 races that are going to determine control of the United States Senate. It's favored to remain in Republican hands, but there, I think we all recognize there's going to be a ton of money put into these races. To date, the Senate Republicans, even though they were defending 23 seats, have only lost a net of 1. They did lose 2, but they picked 1 up, so it's only a net loss of 1. And they were expected to lose a lot more. You know, people were looking at Maine and North Carolina, even Iowa and South Carolina for Lindsey Graham's seat, but the Republicans maintained it. The 2 that lost are actually members of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which I served on. Martha McSally lost her race in Arizona to Mark Kelly, and Cory Gardner, of course, lost in Colorado to John Hickenlooper. On Tuesday, the North Carolina race was finally called for Tom Tillis over Cal Cunningham. And just yesterday, Alaska called the race for Dan Sullivan, although I will say that the Alaskans were pretty confident all along that Sullivan would pull through. So again, if the Democrats prevail in Georgia in January, there will be a 50-50 split in the United States Senate. And the vice president, in this case, Vice President Harris, would break that tie and give majority control to the Democrats. Now for the House races, the House Democrats did not have the election that they expected last week. Speaker Pelosi is now looking at having the smallest majority for the House for 18 years, almost 2 decades. And just a reminder that at the beginning of this Congress, Pelosi actually committed that next Congress, this upcoming Congress, would be her last as Speaker. And there's a lot of finger pointing right now going on within that caucus. So we'll have to see if she is actually challenged for her speakership. Now we were trying to finalize this slide yesterday, my colleague and I, and the numbers kept changing. And so these are AP numbers. The Cook report is out a little bit ahead of them. Cook report has Republicans up at 206 now, so there's still some outstanding races, but really just razor thin, really just reflecting what's happening in the Senate and the rest of the country. So let's look at the scenario that we think we're in, which is the White House flip, where Mitch McConnell maintains his status as majority leader in the Senate, and the House, of course, stays blue. Some policy considerations in a divided government. Like the last 2 administrations, I would expect President Biden to be relying a lot on executive orders. He's already promised to issue up to 4 on his very first day, including rejoining the Paris Agreement. And just as a former Chief Counsel for the Energy Committee, just want to remind people that it takes time to stand up a new administration. The candidates have to be nominated, but before that, they have to go through background checks and do financial disclosures. There's a lot of paperwork that goes into being a candidate. And then you have to go through your staff and member meetings, get through your confirmation hearings successfully, and then finally get some time on the Senate floor for a final confirmation vote. So it's going to take some time in a divided government. It's going to take more time than it would in a blue wave sweep, that's for sure. And another thing to consider, in a blue wave sweep, I think we would have seen some very progressive candidates been nominated for cabinet level positions. If the Senate retains Mitch McConnell as majority leader, they're probably going to have to move to more moderate candidates. It's going to be interesting to see who does get nominated. And we're expecting a lot of members to be tapped for service in the administration. And so that's going to take some time to figure out too, because those seats, if senators or House members leave, those seats have to be filled. Each state has their own way to do it. And we're seeing that now in California as they figure out what to do with Senator Harris's seat as she moves over to take the vice presidency. But I will say too, this last point, that there are still opportunities for legislative action in a divided Congress. But really, it's going to come down to compromise, the art of the compromise. And these 3 things listed at the last part of the slide are where I think we could have compromise. Potential COVID package. Right now, the top line numbers are pretty far apart, but there is will on both sides of the aisle to get something done. It remains to be seen whether that can be done in the lame duck or it could be pushed into the 117th. Infrastructure is always a bipartisan policy position and something that I think both parties would like to work on. And people are talking more and more about a tax package now, because something to consider, the production tax credit ends at the end of this year. And so there is going to be some talk about possibly extending that. So let's take a look at door number 4 and what it would mean to have a blue wave, because again, this is still a possibility and we're not going to know until January 5th. And the way things are going, maybe it'll be January 6th, 7th, or 8th. Well, it might not be the night of. But this is the scenario that the Democrats had certainly planned on. It would have provided a mandate to make sweeping, transformative changes. My guess is they would have preferred to go by legislation. It's certainly always better to get something codified into the United States Code rather than doing something by executive order that the next president can unwind. As I mentioned before, a new administration would certainly be easier to set up under Majority Leader Schumer when shepherding those confirmations through the process. That would be done on a much quicker basis and probably be able to confirm more progressive candidates. COVID, of course, would remain a priority. You could see Democrats trying to use the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, to claw back some of the Trump regulations. but we'll have to see if they get that opportunity with a blue wave scenario. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time kind of looking at the changes in committee leaderships, because these are important committees that will have an impact on transmission policy as we go forward. And they're in alphabetical order, but of course I've listed the most important committee first, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where my former boss, Lisa Murkowski, is now term limited out at the end of this year from being the top Republican on that committee. Republicans in both chambers have term limits of 6 years as ranking and 6 years as chair. So Lisa Murkowski is now in her 12th year, so this will be it for her. So we're expecting Senator John Barrasso from Wyoming to take the top slot at ENR, but that means he's going to have to give up the gavel at the Environment and Public Works Committee. So EPW, we're thinking that Senator Capito, she's the next most senior Republican, she should take the gavel there, which actually puts Joe Manchin and Shelley Capito in a really good position for West Virginia as the leaders for both ENR and EPW. And the Democrats, of course, do not have term limits, and so the names that you see listed here, if they win on January 5th, would in fact become the chairman. On finance, Grassley is term limited out. He is going to go over to Judiciary. So Crabo is going to take over. He's from Idaho. He'll be the new finance chair, partnering with Ron Wyden. And on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, his GAC, Ron Johnson is also term limited out. And so Rob Portman is going to take the reins over there. Some other things listed on this list, Senator Graham leaves Judiciary. He goes over to Budget, where he'll be partnering with Bernie Sanders. And Senator Collins, who won a really tough re-election race, and a lot of people didn't expect her to be back, she is now poised to be number 2 on appropriations. And if Shelby does not run next year, then she would be the top Republican for appropriations in the 118th Congress. Now, we're seeing some movement on the House committee as well, not from the term limits though, and that's going to be the next slide, but more for retirements. The top Republicans at both ENC and Natural Resources are retiring. So you can see the people who are in the race right now to replace both Greg Walden and Rob Bishop. And the same on the Democratic side for the chairman of the All-Important Appropriations Committee. And so there will be a race underway there too to see who takes the gavel for approps on the House side. So let's turn to FERC next. I think we can all recognize the importance of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Our mantra back at the Senate Energy Committee, and something that Chairman Murkowski loved, was to make FERC boring again. That's what we want to do. When I first joined the committee in 2003, FERC was really just a sleepy little independent agency where we had really easy times confirming candidates on a bipartisan basis. So I think the days of making FERC boring again are probably over. I will note that this is the second time this administration has demoted a sitting FERC chairman. You probably all recall at the beginning of this administration, at the start of 2017, we only had 3 FERC commissioners at the time, all Democrats, with Chairman Norman Bay, and he was in fact demoted and decided to leave the commission. And in so doing, he deprived the commission of a working quorum. We lost a working quorum, and we lost it for 6 full months. And so I'm not sure what to say about what happened at FERC last week, but I am grateful that Commissioner Chatterjee has committed to stay on through the end of his term, and that's the end of June 2021. He would, if he's not replaced by then, he would have the option to stay through the rest of the calendar year, because FERC does give you that option. So right now we should be fine with a working quorum. It always makes me nervous, and I'm sure the rest of the industry, when you only have 3, you never know if somebody is going to leave or if they'd have to be recused for some reason. And so we have these 2 pending FERC nominees right now who have gotten through their hearing process and have done all the paperwork and everything necessary to even get to that point, but have yet to be reported out of the Energy Committee. And I think it just got caught up with the end of the year politics and getting to the November 3rd election. And like I've mentioned, 2 of our Republican members on ENR were defeated. And so it's just uncertain whether or not the Energy Committee is going to have the time and the bandwidth to report out these nominees. And then if they did, whether the 2 nominees could actually get confirmed by the end of this year or not. So if not, if it's holding over to the 117th Congress, then I would expect Allison Clements to be renominated. Again, she's gone through the process, she's done her paperwork, she'd be good to go. and probably one of the ones who could be renominated the earliest, and she would be already teed up. But with a new Biden administration, the seat that was held open for Mark Christie would now be a Democratic seat. And so President Biden would have the opportunity to nominate somebody new for that seat. Then when Neil left, you'd have a Republican slot, but it's not necessarily Mark Christie's slot. It would be a Biden decision of who, in fact, he would nominate for that position. So we're looking at the potential of 3 new FERC commissioners in the coming months. So there's just been a lot of uncertainty at the commission. It would be really fantastic to get a full complement of 5 back, so that we're not in danger of losing the working quorum like we've already done once in this administration. So let's turn next to take a look at some of the transmission policy impacts here. And you know, I think there's a growing recognition around policymakers that renewables are not wireless, and that you're going to need a robust grid to actually realize this clean energy future and to meet these environmental goals. We've got, you know, Biden has been clear about his goal for decarbonizing the power sector by 2030. He wants to be economy-wide by 2050. We saw, you know, we see a lot of effort to not only have the electricity sector decarbonize itself, but to help decarbonize the transportation sector through EVs and charging. And this was something that was discussed at FERC's recent technical conference on carbon pricing, and just as the need to make sure that we modernize and update our grid, because we're seeing an alignment of decarbonization goals, both led by state policy efforts, but also large corporate commitments for clean energy and for decarbonization. And so this clean energy, climate change future is happening regardless of which party is in charge, and you need a grid to make that happen. And also, I've got here in the last part of the slide that the Americans for Clean Energy Grid Study just came out, I think a couple of weeks ago, and you know, it's got really fantastic numbers that kind of go hand in hand with this clean energy future. You know, the idea of being able to modernize the transmission grid and generate some almost $8 trillion in investment, some 6 million new domestic jobs. A lot of those would be in rural areas. So, you know, that's what you can kind of get the bipartisan support with these rural areas that are represented by Republicans. When you've got the jobs and the economics behind it. So next, I want to look at some of the legislative attempts on transmission, because Congress really does want to legislate in this area. And there's a lot of interest in both parties and in both chambers to tackle transmission-related legislation. So this slide shows some of the efforts just this Congress on transmission. It is in no way an exhaustive list. And as a recovering Senate snob, I have to say it kills me a little bit to list the 2 House measures first, but they actually passed, so they completely deserve it. The Moving Forward Act was passed by the House back in July. It's the $1.5 trillion infrastructure package. And then the Clean Economy, Jobs and Innovation Act was a combined E&C and Science Committee measure that passed this past September. And both, you know, HR2, this Moving Forward Act, had a lot in transmission. You know, they want to invest something more than $70 billion in transmission upgrades to help accommodate a clean energy transition. Now, my boss's bill, the American Energy Innovation Act, that was up on the floor earlier this year, did not get passed, but also had a number of transmission provisions in there, research and development related and cybersecurity. She is still working, Lisa Murkowski is working with her House colleagues to see if they can marry up some of those provisions from HR 4447, that Clean Economy Jobs Act, and the Senate Energy Innovation Act, and see if there's a way forward, because there's a lot of bipartisan bills in there that deserve to be enacted, and they're just looking for a vehicle because it does not seem that they can do it on a freestanding basis. The Clean Future Act, that was the draft that's had a lot of discussion from E&C, and this is something that sets forth a national policy on transmission. It talks about modernizing the transmission system to facilitate a new decarbonized electricity supply. And then we've got Heinrich's bill here on interregional transmission planning. Now, none of these bills deal with siting. None of them try to tackle it. In fact, the Clean Future Act is the one that goes so far as to acknowledge that it's omitting siting, even though they recognize how important it is, but they actually asked and solicited comments on how to tackle siting. And we'll get to siting in a couple of slides, but let's now move to cyber, because we've talked a lot about what's happening for clean energy and climate change, but that's not the only reason that Congress wants to legislate on transmission-related issues. Cybersecurity reasons are very, very important for them. It's cybersecurity and national defense and grid vulnerability issues. You know, the grid vulnerability is always used as a talking point in the cyber debate of why more needs to be done and why more authority needs to be given to various agencies. I've got EMPs up here, electromagnetic pulses, not necessarily cyber, but a lot of members and staff can talk about them in the same way. They conflate the issue. And so it is part of the discussion. And it's certainly something that the Defense Department is very interested in. You know, and note the competing committee jurisdictions because everybody's pretty much elbowing themselves. You know, we've got the Energy and Natural Resources Committee for trying to protect the FERC-NERC stakeholder process we set up in EPACT 05. You've got, you know, HISGAC, very interested in EMPs, as we just noted. Senator Portman's going to take the gavel. He had an EMP panel just this Congress and had some utility experts there, including FERC and NERC. There's a lot of interest in doing something there outside of ENR's jurisdiction. And all of the agencies too. We've got DOE, we've got our FERC-NERC process, DHS and their new CISA agency. And something to note, you know, beyond just legislation is what the agencies can do in the cyber sphere that could impact transmission. And one of the things we're looking at right now is this May 1st executive order on the bulk power system. And this was directed to DOE to go ahead and implement. We've been expecting a draft rulemaking out of them that would almost maybe dictate what kinds of equipment you could or could not put onto the grid system. And they've missed their deadline. It was supposed to be at the end of September. I'm hearing that they're trying to get something out by the end of the year. But if they don't, what happens in a new Biden administration? A lot of sources are saying that they expect to continue in a Biden administration because the national security concerns are so grave. So we'll have to see what is happening there. But with cyber, it's beyond just legislation. You've got to look at what the agencies are doing as well. But let's get into siting next, because that is always fun. Congress has not legislated on siting since the Energy Policy Act of 2005, some 15 years ago. And some of you will remember how controversial those provisions were at the time. We went ahead and we bifurcated that agency authority. We gave DOE the ability to study congested transmission areas and designate these NETCs, these national interest electric transmission corridors. And then within those corridors, we gave FERC backstop siting authority. Now, this little graph here is kind of showing the court system stopping all of that, because after decisions by the 4th and the 9th Circuit on the legislation, not a single mile of transmission has been built as a result of EPACT 05, despite the controversy. But that said, that siting provision is still technically on the books. And another provision from EPACT that people seem to forget about sometimes that's also still on the books is this section 1222, the Power Marketing Administration section for SWAPA and WAPA. And this is where Congress authorized DOE to engage in public-private partnerships on transmission. And in doing so, if those PMAs are involved, they bring with it federal condemnation authority. And so you get the eminent domain that is needed within siting. So that was tried a few years ago. They tried to utilize it, but it was unsuccessful. But it is still on the books and could be revisited in a new administration. Now, a couple of the other things I have on here are just recent congressional attempts that have actually been enacted on transmission that fall short of siting, but some of the things that they've tried to do. The FAST Act of 2015 that had the permitting council on it, for which transmission is eligible. But unfortunately, we're hearing from the clean energy industry that while they had high hopes for it, it hasn't worked as intended because nobody's handled and tackled the siting issue. And so without siting, they can't get the permitting process to actually work. The other thing we did in the omnibus appropriations measure in FY 2018 was to try to handle vegetation management issues. That was really more about access for utilities to get on existing rights of way and to be able to trim trees and other vegetation away from power lines. Again, not siting, but still transmission related. So as I mentioned before in that recent slide of the legislation that's been introduced to date, nothing's on siting, even though the Clean Future Act solicited comments on that. What we're hearing now is that siting legislation is in fact under development by some E&C members. Specifically, I'm hearing Representatives Tonko and Peters are working on something in collaboration with E&C staff, presumably using some of the comments that they received from the Clean Future draft. I will be very curious to see what they come up with and whether or not they are willing to have the federal government overturn state decisions. Because I really think that federal preemption is going to be what it takes. In the Energy Policy Act, one of the things that we had done for the FERC backstop authority was said that FERC could do it if a state utility commission had withheld approval for over a year. Well, if a state utility commission says no, that's not withholding approval. And so that's not going to be good enough. It's federal preemption is what's going to be needed. And that's really been the rub because members are very reluctant to go ahead and do that federal preemption and invoke the eminent domain that comes with it. So let's just take a look for this last slide of what is next in working with policymakers. There are a lot of opportunities, and right now we're in a lame duck session. The Senate is back. The House will be back next week. And the primary thing that they need to do in this lame duck session is keep the government funded. The CR, the continuing resolution, expires in December 11th. And we're still in a contested election scenario, so it's a very tricky time. But we have to keep the government funded. There's some talk about doing a big omnibus appropriations measure, and the Senate has released all of their marks now this week. I think that would be very, very hard to do in a short amount of time. I think it's probably more likely that the CR gets extended into next year, and then they try to work on an omnibus appropriations after they get past the December 11th date. Other things that could get done in lame duck are NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. That's pretty cooked. It could get done, but it also could slip. There are some issues that still need to be worked out. COVID, I don't have on here because it's not really a vehicle. It doesn't seem to be a vehicle for transmission-related policy, but an infrastructure bill certainly would be. And you can maybe see an infrastructure bill kind of masquerading as COVID relief. And I don't really see that happening in a lame duck, but it is something that Biden has said he wanted to do in his first 100 days. And I think transmission policy obviously fits very well within an infrastructure package. Tax package, again, the PTC is expiring. Our members going to want to try to address that. There has been efforts to get an ITC for storage, perhaps an ITC for transmission. There are some proposals out there to do a technology neutral tax credit that would replace all the existing, the PTC and the ITC, all the individual tax credits. So maybe we could see some kind of tax overhaul for which transmission could benefit. The other thing too is we've got to look at what's happening with the agencies next year. Does DOE go forward with implementing the bulk power system executive order? What is FERC doing on their cyber incentives? They've got a notice of inquiry out. What are they doing on ROE? They've got a proposed rulemaking. Don't forget trade, commerce in the USTR. There's been a lot of activity in trade in this administration. And right now there's an ongoing investigation, Section 232 investigation on transformers, and it's likely going to lead to tariffs. We'll have to see on that, but that can impact the industry too. And so at the start of a new Congress, particularly with so many new chairs or ranking members, depending on how January 5th works out, it's a great opportunity to go in and educate these new members and their new staff, the new committee staff and individual staff on transmission-related issues and on things that your companies need to see. The nominations process is always a great time to kind of understand where the nominees are coming from, but also to get commitments for them on what they're going to do once they're in office and what kind of, for example, what kind of funding proposals that they're willing to kind of carry and what they can do administratively. But there are going to be a lot of things to work on in the 117th Congress, and certainly a lot of opportunities for transmission given that both parties in both chambers really want to do something on transmission, whether that's to facilitate a clean energy future or to get the economic benefits of investments and jobs, or if it's to secure the grid and national security reasons through cyber. There will be efforts at both the agency level and at the legislative level to tackle some of these transmission issues. And so the sooner companies and individuals can get in there and make their positions known, I think the better, and people can look at you as a resource going forward. Because one thing that Senator Murkowski always used to say was the one law that Congress gets right all the time is the law of unintended consequences. And so the way to guard against that is to get in early and to make sure that staff understand what those unintended consequences can be. And so with that, that's wrapping up our slide presentation, but we can now move to the question format.
Well, thanks, Kelly. That was very interesting, and I found it really informative. I appreciate hearing your perspective on it. I'd invite our members to submit any, or our participants to submit any questions that they have. I'd be happy to forward them along. In the meantime, let me ask you a couple questions that I have based on my thinking through some of this. One is, we are in a situation right now where there is still a level of uncertainty, both with respect to the Senate composition of the House, but also there's still some outstanding questions with respect to the presidential level. And one thing that's happening is the transition process is being slowly implemented, if implemented at all. Not sure how long that's going to drag on, or when that would get resolved. As that time passes and we get into weeks, what do you think the impact is on the slowing down of the commencement or progress on the transition process on all of this, both with respect to engagement with the Hill, but also stuff with respect to nominations and decisions within the administration?
Well, hopefully, I have heard the same thing, and hopefully that won't last that much longer. I've heard that a number of Senate Republicans are very disturbed by this and want to make sure that the incoming administration has the funds that they need, because these are federal funds that they use for transmission. It's not for campaign funds for the transition. So the members want to make sure that they get the funds that they need so that they can start get their offices into the agencies and start getting geared up and to go forward. Now, I've heard that the campaign had anticipated this, the Biden campaign had anticipated this and might have some money set aside to help with some of this transition, although again, it's supposed to be federal funding, and that's not the way this is supposed to be done. But yeah, you can see how this could delay everything. And the nomination process in particular, just because again, there's just so much paperwork, and that, you know, people don't fully understand that. They think it's your nomination, you're nominated, and it should just be able to go forward. But you've got to get all the paperwork, which means you've got to get the clearances on the agency side as well through their ethics officer and you know, just the basic sign off from the Office of Personnel Management before a nomination package is actually forwarded formally to the Hill.
Thanks. The other question I had really kind of focuses on FERC and the current status with the pending nominees in light of the election outcome and what we may be facing next year. And just curious as to your thoughts on this. So I'm hearing a couple of different perspectives with respect to the nominees versus, as far as action now versus wait and see what might happen next year. You know, if you move forward and confirm the two nominees now, you go into next year with a Democratic-led administration, but with this weird circumstance of 3 members of the opposite party constituting a majority of the commission. And you would think that to some extent there would be the incentive on the Democratic side to, well, let's just wait and we put up 2 Democratic nominees next year and have a majority. But I am hearing some people speculate, because this is Washington and this is what we do, right? Speculate that, well, if you do that, then a Republican-led Senate, if that's what we're facing, could either slow down the process or actually not act at all on Democratic nominees and keep those open and let it go. And I guess I'm curious as to your perspective on, do you think that if we were facing that situation, the Senate would just simply not act on Democratic nominees? What do you think the thinking would be behind all of that?
That is a good question, and it will be more difficult, as I mentioned, in the divided government for the Biden appointees to get through a confirmation process. You know, there's some bad blood at the leadership level, I think, from how the other party handled the Trump administration's nominees. You know, it wasn't, I can back up, you know, when we did the Obama administration for the incoming, we confirmed those nominees. Ken Salazar was on our committee. I mean, it was very, very easy. It was record time. It was just a lot of goodwill to help stand up the new administration. And I don't know that that's where we are. Again, there's some bad blood about having to change the rules this administration for how the nominees are processed on the Senate floor, just because of all the delaying tactics. So, you know, we'll have to see what Mitch McConnell does with that, or whether or not they can kind of get back to a more normal process. But for these two nominees, you know, I had really expected ENR to report them out already, because usually we try to move like on a fairly quick basis. But unfortunately, I think they just got caught up in election year politics, with people just focused on their campaigns. As we said, like 2 members are not going to be coming back from ENR, just really, really tough races. And I just don't think that this was necessarily a priority at the time. Now, whether or not the Democrats want to go ahead and still confirm them, you know, that's up to them. I know that Ranking Member Manchin very much wants to, and he's still pressing to get them out. I think they could get out of committee. It's just, will they in this lame duck session be able to get across the finish line or not? And it would be a very unusual situation to lock in a Republican majority in a new Democratic controlled executive branch. It would be very unusual. That would end, I guess, in June when Commissioner Chatterjee's term ended, and then you could get a new Democrat in there. You know, maybe it does make sense to wait until the next year. You could even see a situation, and this is what makes me nervous about the potential of losing a quorum, if they do wait till next year, knowing that that Commissioner Chatterjee will leave and there will be an open Republican seat. You know, does Majority Leader McConnell want to do 3 FERC nominees at once? Does he want to do two Dems and 1 Republican all at once? And I guess the other thing, just for consideration for folks, if you're waiting to the 117th Congress, is where do the FERC nominees fall into the Biden administration as far as priorities and who they're going to try to get stand up first? You know, I would imagine you'd be starting with the cabinet level secretaries necessarily, and then going through down to the sub cabinet. And so where does FERC fall into it? And I think that is a consideration of how long would you have to wait to get more FERC nominees, you know, not just processed, but actually confirmed.
Yeah, that's a great point. As a former FERC staffer, you know, I just assume the world revolves around FERC, so that would rise to the top. But I then realized that's simply not the case. But let me ask you, I did get a couple of additional questions from some people. And one was this: it says, for years, one of WIRE's primary avenues for advocacy was a set of briefings that were meant to educate staffers. Are there better ways for WIRE's to educate staff, particularly if there's a changeover in staff on the Republican side of Senate Energy?
Well, and there will be, right? Because not only did we lose 2 members, but Senator Alexander retired, so there's 3 Republican members gone, and it's going to be a new leadership staff team, because Barrasso will be coming in, and he'll, you know, you always have a change in staff director, you always have a change in communications director, and then after that, it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. So we're going to see changes all around. I think those group briefings are great, but I also think, you know, don't underestimate, even though it takes more time, the benefit of one-on-one meetings. And if you could go in and have some kind of connection to that office, some kind of state connection, but if not, you know, it's the national transmission priority. You know, I think staff are certainly receptive to learning about this issue. I think everyone recognizes that transmission is going to be on the table next Congress, and folks need to get smart about it, because again, we've tackled it in kind of bite-sized pieces over the years with enacted provisions in the FAST Act and the Omnibus Act, but it's been quite some time since EPACT 05 that we've done a big overhaul of transmission, including siting. And so I think it is going to be important for WIRES to go in and educate new members and new staff, and to do it on an individual basis, and to really try to be a resource for people. And then I would also offer yourselves up as potential witnesses at hearings as well, and to bring that subject matter expertise directly to the members themselves and help build the record as they're putting legislation together.
Okay, good, thanks. And then this one falls into the category of nominee gossip kind of thing, and which also we just love. But the question was, have you heard any names of potential FERC nominees next year if there isn't confirmation in the lame duck session this year?
People are certainly, I haven't heard of a name that the Biden administration is necessarily thinking. I have heard names that other people are starting to think about and put forward. And you know, people have been wondering if Clements would be renominated. And again, I'd be very surprised if she wasn't, because I thought she did a really good job at her confirmation hearing. You know, she's gone through the process. You can't underestimate that. And what we had done in the past, now this was for the same administration, the same committee, but if a nominee had gotten through the hearing but hadn't gotten confirmed, the next Congress we bypassed the hearing. Now nominees they're only good for one session, and so this was probably within Congress. But if they had gone through one session and they hadn't gotten confirmed, we went straight to their markup, to their business meeting, and bypassed the hearing. Now I don't know that they would do that for her, but it's an option to try to expedite her nomination as well. Yep,
good. You are clearly a seasoned Senate veteran, because you did a great job of dodging my question on specifics. But I certainly understand that. Hey, let me ask you another question about something you talked about earlier, which was citing and the difficulty with citing provisions. And you mentioned that even some of the legislation that was working its way through specifically said it wasn't going to address citing. You know, from a lot of my members' perspectives, citing and permitting is just one of the biggest obstacles and one of the biggest challenges to getting transmission, particularly long distance transmission, built. And that's what we think we're probably going to need more of with integration of renewables into the grid. So I guess my question is any effort legislatively on citing basically just dead on arrival, too big a hill to climb? You talked somewhat about the difficult politics surrounding citing legislation. So I guess the question is it worth the effort on it? If it is, what should we be thinking about doing? Or is there something maybe we should think about on the regulatory side rather than on the legislative side?
Well, I think maybe a two-pronged effort on this is, one, look at the existing statutory authorities, because there are there, and whether or not that they can actually be utilized. You know, could the Biden administration go in and do a new rulemaking based on the 2005 Energy Policy Act and the transmission corridors and the backstop siting authority? Could they do that? You know, one of the dings on that was the bifurcated agency authority and having DOE do one part and FERC do another. Could DOE give their authority to FERC? Could they delegate their authority to FERC? They could, and that could be, you know, a new avenue to try to get some kind of efficiencies from that. But on the legislative front, I absolutely think it's worth it, and it's been 15 years. And even though EPAC didn't work as we had intended, the will was there. I mean, it was controversial, but at the end of the day, the members did approve it, and it did get enacted. So it's been done once. I think it would probably have to be for a subset of transmission lines, some kind of high priority, some kind of national interest transmission lines that you would have kind of a super status, or to be able to get that preemption ability, because I do think that's what it's going to take. And it can't be, I think what we did in EPAC was kind of let the courts decide. Well, yeah, the courts decided, and they decided that it didn't work. And so you really need to have something that is going to be able to survive litigation. But I do think it's an effort. it's worth the effort, because there are so many reasons to do it. And on the economic reasons too, this is where I think you can get the bipartisan support, because so many of these projects now are being built obviously in rural areas, a lot of them under Republican representation, who see the benefits of the jobs and the investments in these towns and want to continue that. And so I think you can find agreement across the aisle on this, or at least try to. I think, again, members are starting to realize that it is important to tie transmission into things. Another thing, maybe Congress could think about, they're talking about a clean energy standard. Again, if it's a blue wave, it's one situation, a different and divided government. But could you tie transmission, the need for transmission to policy? Could you tie it in there? We did a little bit in, I think, the 110th Congress, but the opposite way. And this is when Bingaman had a renewable portfolio standard. And one of the amendments was, you didn't have to do it if you didn't get the needed transmission. Reverse that and make sure that you're getting the transmission so that you can facilitate the renewable resources and get them to live.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen success with emphasizing that linkage between transmission investment and job creation, particularly in, and as you said, rural areas where they desperately need those jobs. And now with the need for economic recovery in light of the response to the pandemic, I mean, even all the more so. So there has been some real opportunity for us to draw out that language and make those connections and get some support for projects because of the job opportunities associated with it. And then one more thing I wanted to ask you about, because you also talked a little bit about the idea of federal preemption in this area, because I think that's the linkage that we're talking about for it to succeed. I guess I'm wondering how much the well has been poisoned on that because of what's happened on the gas pipeline side and all the issues surrounding that. And in my mind, that only further complicates it. But I guess I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on how that impacts this issue on the FPA side now.
Well, I think one of the issues with the natural gas pipelines has been some members' opposition to the fossil fuels aspect of it. And so for transmission, I think you can make the distinction here that it's, to facilitate clean energy resources. I think folks can appreciate that and distinguish between the pipelines. But you're right. I mean, it does kind of muddy the waters. But that's what a bigger infrastructure package can help with. With members really taking a look at these issues and figuring out what is going to make the most sense as we try to modernize and upgrade our system. And I'm just heartened to see that policymakers are starting to appreciate, again, the importance of transmission. Yes, it's difficult, but there's a time period on the Hill where people were coming to us and saying it's all going to be distributed energy resources. We don't need the big transmission lines anymore. And that's completely shifted. And now it's really all about utility scale, and you do need these big lines. And how are you going to get these sited? And so, another thought too is to have some kind of partnership with NARUC and with the state public utility commissions, and really, try to get the planning done in the right way, and to get the buy-in, and so that it's not it's not people fighting each other, but people trying to come together for solutions. Easier said than done, but an infrastructure package is definitely the place to do it. And the recognition that it needs to get done is half the battle.
Yeah, great. Well, I don't have any more questions from any of the participants on here. I wanted to just thank you for taking the time to join us and talk through some of these issues. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out going forward. And thanks again for participating, and thanks to all of our participants who tuned in for this today. And appreciate your time, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We're going to call it a wrap.